This is video 3, the shoulder girdle. So in this video we will talk about the shoulder girdle in general, where it is, its functions, and that sort of thing, and we'll take a look specifically at the clavicle and the scapula and look at all of their landmarks. And then also we'll do a little wrap up of the first week and take a look at homework and that kind of thing. Okay, so our first piece is looking at the shoulder girdle. So as we know, the shoulder girdle is this connection between the axial skeleton and the upper extremity. So it is what connects the two of those things together. The shoulder girdle is made up of two bones, the clavicle and the scapula, and so let's take a look at those here. So this is mostly the axial skeleton, but it does have a shoulder girdle attached to it here. So here's the scapula, and here's the clavicle. So the clavicle is, in lay terms, referred to as the collarbone, and the scapula, in lay terms, is referred to as the shoulder blade. What those words mean, the clavicle means key, and what's interesting about that is that, if you can see it, it kind of looks like one of those, kind of big old-fashioned skeleton keys, that you would see on Scooby-Doo or whatever. And so it means key, but one thing that's interesting about it meaning key, the word key, is that it is the last bone of the body to stop growing. And so it's as if the size of the skeleton gets locked in place once the clavicle is finished growing. So the clavicle, some energetics of the clavicle. Energetically and emotionally, the clavicle is where we wear our honors. And so if we're proud of our accomplishments, we hold our clavicle in such a way that our honors and our pride in our accomplishments is apparent and shows through us. So that's the clavicle. Let's take a quick look at the scapula and what that means, and then we'll go into more detail on the clavicle. The scapula, the word scapula, it means spade, like a shovel. Like, does this look like you could take this off of here and use it as a shovel to, do your flower garden or whatever? It means spade. So because of its pointed tip and the shape, and it's very flat. You can see if we look at it this way, I have another model here too. So see how thin this bone is? Not much to it, unless we look at it like this or like this. Okay, so energetically, the scapula is the heart's wings. And so if the shoulder girdle in general is not placed correctly on the skeleton, which the most common misplacement of them on the skeleton is a rounded forward kind of posture where the heart gets closed off, which is, we see that in a lot of people, like a rounding forward of the shoulders and kind of a slouched posture. That's a closing off of the heart. And when the scapula and clavicle are positioned correctly on the skeleton, then the heart has its wings. So the energetic piece that I'm sharing of the bones comes from Hugh Milne's book, The Heart of Listening. So if you want to look into more of that, that's where you'll find that information. Okay, let's look at the clavicle more closely and look at landmarks on it. So there are two articulations of the clavicle. So again, what we're looking at here is a left clavicle and scapula. Okay, so I could, if I put this on me, it would fit my left side like that. Okay, so see the S shape, kind of it's kind of straight, but it's sort of an S shape in the clavicle. So the clavicle works a lot like a bumper. Like, think of the bumper on your car. It has curves to it, and those curves are there for a reason. So everything in anatomy is there for a reason, right? There are no anatomical accidents. And so the shape of the bone gives rise to its function. Part of the function of the clavicle is to protect underlying structures. So the clavicle on the body runs right through here, and deep to the clavicle, just posterior to it, runs a neurovascular bundle that needs to be protected. And so that's partly the job of the clavicle, is to protect that neurovascular bundle that runs out to the arm. And so if we get hit from the front, the clavicle absorbs that absorbs that impact and protects those underlying structures. If we get hit from the side, which is pretty common, like if we imagine, let's look at this one again. Imagine this skeleton is walking along and he slips and falls on the ice, kaboom, and he lands on his side and doesn't have time to get his arm out and just like lands on the shoulder like that. The clavicle takes that impact. So the curves of the clavicle are able to, kind of buckle the way the bumper of a car does and absorb the impact so that other structures don't get harmed. And so, and we see that sort of thing throughout the skeleton, in the face, in the pelvic girdle. We see these curves and bones, and those are a protective. They serve a protective function, protecting underlying structures, but also serving to absorb shock from impact so that underlying structures don't absorb that shock. So there are two joints that the clavicle is a part of. On this end of the clavicle, the only landmark we need to know on the clavicle on this end is called the sternal end, and on this end it's called the acromial end, because this end of the clavicle articulates with the sternum, which we can see on this model. Okay, so it articulates with the sternum. So here's the sternum. We'll go over that in a couple of weeks, but the very top part of the sternum is called the manubrium, and the clavicle articulates there with the manubrium, forming the sternoclavicular joint. The sternoclavicular joint is the only place where the shoulder girdle actually articulates with the axial skeleton. The rest of the shoulder girdle, even though in this model it's all attached with screws, in real life it kind of floats there and is held in place with muscles, but this is the only joint right here, which is not much of a joint really if you look at it. This is the only place where the shoulder girdle articulates with the axial skeleton. So this is the sternoclavicular joint. So this is the sternal end of the clavicle, and then we have the acromial end of the clavicle, and that's where the acromioclavicular joint is. So this is the acromial end. It's called the acromial end because this process of the scapula is called the acromial process, or the acromion, and so the two of those come together, and so that's why this is called the acromial end. It's the end that articulates with the acromion of the scapula. Okay, so that's the clavicle. Let's take a look at the scapula. I'm going to switch back to this smaller model to look at the scapula. It has a lot more landmarks than the clavicle does. And it also just has two joints, but we just learned one of them. So there's this joint. You can see this okay. The acromioclavicular joint is one of the joints of the scapula that we can see here. Okay. And then the other joint of the scapula, this is the part of it that forms it, is called the glenohumeral joint. And that is the shoulder joint. So let's take a look at the parts of the scapula. So remember, what we're looking at here is a left scapula. So if you're comparing this to a diagram that you're looking at, if you're looking at a right scapula, don't get confused, because the right scapula will be a mirror image of this one. This is a left scapula. Most diagrams are right, whatever they are. So you may be looking at a mirror image of the scapula if you're looking in the book. Okay, so here are the landmarks on the scapula. I'll go through those, but I will also define some of these terms that are going to be new as we start talking about landmarks on bones. So the first couple of landmarks, this is the inferior angle of the scapula. The inferior angle is here, the superior angle is here. So angle just refers to a corner, so you can see that these shapes kind of make a corner here. So we have an inferior angle and a superior angle. So now we're starting to see some of our directional terms coming into play, and we see why we have and why we use those directional terms. Superior angle, inferior angle. Easy enough. There are three borders of the scapula, because the scapula is a triangular shape. So this border here is the border that is closest to the spine, and so we would call this either the medial border or the vertebral border. So let's look at it here. Okay, medial border or vertebral border, here and here. Okay, so if you're trying to orient on a diagram that you're looking at, the root, so this part of the scapula right here is called the spine of the scapula. So here and on this side right here is the spine of the scapula. The root of the spine comes out of the medial border of the scapula. And then the opposite border over here, the lateral border at the top of it, is this fossa, which is called the glenoid fossa, which is part of the shoulder joint. So you can always orient, if you have a scapula floating in space and you don't know, am I looking at a right, am I looking at a left, is this the medial border, is this the lateral border? The spine of the scapula, the root of the spine comes out of the medial border, and the lateral border has the glenoid fossa at the top of it. Okay, and then there is also a superior border, which is right here. That's the superior border. So we have a superior border, a medial or vertebral border, and a lateral or axillary border. So axillary referring to armpit area, axillary border, or lateral border. Okay, so those are the three borders. There are four fossas on the scapula. A fossa is an indentation in a bone. So a lot of times when we see fossas on bones, those are places where that bone articulates with another bone. So it's like an indentation that's going to receive a part of another bone to create an articulation. But also fossas on bones can be places sort of like, kind of like a carved out part that then is filled with muscle. And that's the case for at least three of the four fossas that we see on the scapula. And one of them is for an articulation. So let's look at these fossas. So we have the infraspinous fossa. So remember that this landmark here is the spine of the scapula. And can you see that the spine of the scapula, it sticks off the scapula a bit, right? The scapula is this pretty skinny bone, but we have the spine of the scapula sticking off there, right? So there are a couple of fossas here whose name is derived from their location in relationship to the spine of the scapula. So this is the infraspinous fossa here. So infra is a word part that means below, and spinous refers to the spine of the scapula. So infraspinous fossa. So it's a shallow kind of indentation in the bone that is below the spine of the scapula. That's the infraspinous fossa. The supraspinous fossa is here. It's in here. I'm afraid the light is making it hard to see. The infraspinous fossa. So here's the spine of the scapula. This indentation up above here is the supraspinous fossa. So interestingly, and we're going to see a lot of this kind of thing playing out in anatomy, that the names correlate. So the muscle that fills in this space, fills in the infraspinous fossa, is called infraspinatus. The muscle that fills in the supraspinous fossa is called supraspinatus. So they share names like that. Okay, so those are two fossas on the scapula, the infraspinous fossa, the supraspinous fossa. And then if we turn it around and look at the anterior side of the scapula, we're going to find the subscapular fossa. So subscapular means below the scapula. If we look at it here, so the infraspinous fossa, the supraspinous fossa are on the posterior aspect of the scapula. If we turn it around, we can't really see the anterior part of the scapula that much because it's the part that is kind of up against the rib cage here. We can kind of see it there a bit, right? So this is considered to be below the scapula. If we were bipeds and we walked around like this certainly would seem below the scapula under here. But anyway, so this is the subscapular fossa, the one that is on the anterior side. And that's essentially the entire anterior side of the scapula is the subscapular fossa. And the muscle that fills in there is called subscapularis. So more of the connecting of the names there. So that's three of the four fossas. The fourth one is called the glenoid fossa, which I referred to earlier. The glenoid fossa is the socket of the ball and socket joint of the shoulder. So this is a very important landmark on the scapula because the shoulder joint is formed there. There are some landmarks around the glenoid fossa whose names are derived from their location around the glenoid fossa. So there's an infraglenoid tubercle. So a tubercle is a small bump on a bone. We're going to see some other bones that have large bumps, and those are going to be called tuberosities. But small bumps are called tubercles. So on the scapula, below the the glenoid fossa, we have an infraspinous tubercle, an infraglenoid tubercle, and then above we have the supraglenoid tubercle. And so tubercles on bones are typically places where muscles attach with a small attachment. You know, whereas like this fossa, that's a large attachment site. And so at a large attachment site like this, the muscle might be kind of more smooth, but a small attachment site, when the muscle kind of is just like one little part that attaches there, then when that muscle, every time that muscle pulls, it pulls on the bone, and it pulls that attachment site, or that landmark that we just named, it pulls it into existence because it stimulates bone growth every time it pulls on the bone there. So a lot of the bumps that we see on bones exist because muscles attach there, which is why we go through and name them, because when we go back and learn the muscles, then we know the attachment sites, and the attachment sites are there for a reason because the muscles attach there. So we have the glenoid fossa, which is the socket part of the ball and socket joint of the shoulder, also known as the glenohumeral joint. So gleno, that's for the glenoid fossa, humero for the humerus, so glenohumeral joint. And then our two tubercles, the infraglenoid tubercle and the supraglenoid tubercle. A couple of other landmarks on the scapula. We have this right here, we have the coracoid process. All right, see how it sticks out a bit from the bone? And that's the most anterior part of the bone. So if we look, so here, this is a lateral view. This is by far the most anterior part of the bone, whereas the spine of the scapula back here is by far the most posterior part of the bone. So let's see. Okay, so the coracoid process is here, and if we find the coracoid process on our own body, we should be able to palpate it. It's just below the clavicle. You know, so the clavicle starts at the sternal end, and if we palpate the clavicle, we're going to feel that kind of S-shaped curve. So the clavicle starts to move posterior. If we find that posterior part and then move inferiorly into soft tissue, in there we should find the coracoid process of the scapula. I'll show you on here. Let's see. So if we were palpating the clavicle along here, so here where the clavicle goes posteriorly, where you can feel that curve of the S shape, if we move inferiorly from there, then we can palpate the coracoid process of the scapula. Okay, can you see that guy? Coracoid process. Okay, so there's the coracoid process of the scapula. That's a very anteriorly oriented process that is in palpation, is found just below the clavicle. One muscle that attaches there is pectoralis minor. And then another process that we have on the scapula kind of sprouts out of the spine of the scapula. So here's the spine of the scapula, and then this process here is the acromion process, which we already talked about because that's where the acromial end of the clavicle attaches. The acromion process is essentially the end of the spine, so it comes out of the spine. It makes this nice flat part on the top of the shoulder, which you also should be able to palpate on yourself. It's a very flat feeling kind of aspect of the shoulder right on top there. That's the acromion process. Okay, so I think that covers all of the landmarks of the scapula and clavicle. Let me just double check our notes here. Yes, that looks good. Let's talk about actions and movements of the shoulder girdle. So the shoulder girdle doesn't move a lot. It's kind of an interesting sort of thing. Like we said, it is the connection between the upper extremity and the axial skeleton. So we're not going to see a lot of big movements of the shoulder girdle itself, because a lot of what it's doing is stabilizing so that the movements of the upper extremity have a stable place to come from. But it does move, of course, and it needs to be able to move, and the more that it can move, the more the greater range of motion the upper extremity has. So the movements of the shoulder girdle are these. The shoulder girdle does elevation, which looks like this, depression, that looks like this, okay? Elevation and depression. It does protraction, which is also called abduction, which is a moving forward, So like a rounding the shoulder forward, that's protraction or abduction, abduction, and retraction or a deduction. So protraction, retraction. Those are two more movements of the shoulder girdle. So elevation, depression, protraction, retraction, and then the other thing that it does is a rotation. And so the rotation that happens in the shoulder girdle has a couple of names. So to make this rotation happen, we need to do this, which seems like, this looks like a shoulder movement. It doesn't look like it's a movement of the shoulder girdle. But what's happening when I do this, let's look at it here. So this is actually, okay, this is the left scapula and clavicle. So when my arm is out to my side like this is the position of the scapula, and the muscles around it that attach it to it are stabilized. Especially if I had a weight in my hand, the stabilizing muscles will be working hard to stabilize this so that I can move that weight around and have the shoulder girdle stay put. But if I want to take that weight or take my arm and move it overhead, the scapula has to do this. Okay, so what's happening is the glenoid fossa has to rotate upward to allow that glenohumeral joint to move up. So now I can move my shoulder around up in a different place than down here. So it goes from here to here, and we could call it upward rotation because that glenoid fossa is moving from this position, which is the position it's in an anatomical position, to this position, which is the position it's in with upward rotation. So anytime we put our arm up overhead, the scapula has to rotate, and it has to do an upward rotation. So the other term for upward rotation is lateral rotation. So when we refer to it as upward rotation, our point of reference is the glenoid fossa, and it turns upward, which is a good point of reference and makes sense, because that's why we're doing that, is we need to move that shoulder joint so that we can move the arm around up above the body. So upward rotation, but we can also call it lateral rotation. When we call it lateral rotation, we're using the inferior angle as a reference point, and it's moving laterally when that rotation occurs. So lateral rotation or upward rotation, those are the same thing. So this puts the arm overhead. To bring the arm back down again, we're going to do downward rotation or medial rotation. So going from here back to anatomical position here is downward rotation or medial rotation. So the inferior angle moves medially, and at the same time, the glenoid fossa moves downward. So downward rotation or medial rotation. So those are the actions of the scapula, or the actions of the shoulder girdle. The clavicle always moves along when the scapula moves. They create an articulation here at the acromioclavicular joint. So it's always along for the ride wherever the scapula is going. And it's mostly kind of a supportive structure. Sometimes you see it referred to sort of like a kickstand. It's supporting the scapula and giving some more stability to this bone that literally is just floating there and is not attached to the axial skeleton in any articulation other than through this articulation of the clavicle. Okay, so that's it for landmarks on the scapula and clavicle. Let's take a look at homework that we have for this week. Okay, this is the last part of video 3 about the shoulder girdle, and I just want to touch base and wrap up the week to take a look at homework and stuff. So first of all, we have responses to videos. So we had our response to video 1 was the word skeleton. Response to video 2 is the word move, and response to video 3 is the word shoulder girdle. So when you go into Populi, you'll see you'll have a test that you can take, and it's just one multiple choice question, and it will ask you what those response words are. So that's one piece of homework, and so that's how you get your credit for for watching the videos. Next piece of homework is going over the regional terms. So you can either do that, I hope to upload, I haven't done this yet, upload a PDF of a diagram that you can label, because your workbook or the coloring book doesn't have one for this, or you can do like what I did in the video with Essie, where I wrote out all the the regional terms and I stuck them all over her body in the right places. So you can do that as an option too. And then if you do that, take a picture. And if you do the worksheet, take a picture and send it to me, and that's how you get credit for it. Let's see, the movement homework, you can either do a video of yourself going through all the movements, or you can do a worksheet, again, that I hope to upload here in just a minute. And the third part is the shoulder girdle homework. So in your coloring book on pages 16 and 17 are diagrams of the shoulder girdle, so you can go through and label those and you know, draw on all the landmarks, or you know, either circle or point to or do with a different color each of the landmarks that we talked about. If you have the Essential Anatomy 5 app, you can take a look at the shoulder girdle. There's nothing you can do homework-wise as far as turning it in, but take a look at the app, and that gives you a really nice three-dimensional view of the scapula and clavicle, and you can, you know, rotate the image around and take a look at different angles and that kind of thing. Okay, so I hope you have enjoyed week 1 immensely, and week 2 we will be getting into the upper extremities. So we'll start looking at the humerus, the radius, the ulna, the carpals, the metacarpals, the tarsals. I mean, sorry, not the tarsals, the metacarpals, the phalanges. So we'll look at the bones of the upper extremity, the movements of the upper extremity, and then I think, let's look, week 2 we are going to start getting into muscles, the superficial muscles of the back. So we're going to start essentially looking at the muscles that, a lot of the muscles that attach to the scapula. So we'll start moving that guy around with muscles. Alrighty, I will see you in class, and have a great day.